portion of Ends of Ages numero 6. This one's called Ode to John, John Jr. number 3. Some more of the chronicles of the Time Wars tales is when they were using Pony Express routes. They were looking for young, wiry fellows at this time. So some of the travelers fit the bill, and they even got sent to jails when they chased people. Cottonwood Falls was a big area in Chase County where they chased people, and there's also things going on like people trying to make their own money when banks made their own notes and their own dollars. So one of these jails that I ended up at, I wrote her on the jail door, and then the jailers didn't believe my story because they didn't believe that I was a female, actually. So that word her is still on the jail cell, and many of the other monikers and names that we had used during different times, we wrote on things or inscribed on the floors, on jail cell walls, and other places that we were trapped at temporarily, stone walls, because a lot of these places were in the middle of nowhere sometimes. It's like you would be out there just like left and forgotten about, and it was very lonely. So it felt like you were almost falling through the cracks of time as these time bandits, just writing on the walls. So they used Pony Express messengers in part of the time travel program, but in reality, some of us were actually messengers sent from a higher source, being born into being a sort of time messenger of sorts, being translated and rewritten, carrying messages in tech. So another place was Kansas. There's different stations set up at many places. Station 15 is one place that I was time glitching out at. And a cruel trick that they played on me once was to jump me there when there was just mannequins there of us instead of actual people. So you had strange moments like that too, that you had to keep it together, get your bearings straight, and recalibrate yourself so you could tether yourself back to the real deal and stabilization factors like time phase, conjunction, sequencing, sequestering horse jumps, and like 4 or 5D chess, interludes. We were playing with these hidden masters and the most prestigious of people, the hidden hands in intelligence communities. So we also traversed the Four Corners region before the Four Corners was named out west as the Sacred Four Corners. This one was Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, up over that Midwestern area, fighting and scaling up sizes of evil that was prelude to the Civil War and post-Civil War times. We saw the powerful heads of slavery. A lot of times were not men, were entities that we contended with, and we saw many innocent people go up against them and whole families and reverends, families, communities, and they didn't understand that their little weapons couldn't defeat these draconian overlords that were actually bringing advanced technology back in time. So they didn't really get that. They could even bring, like, say, a hybrid dog, like a Nazi would use or something, and they did that also, and then they put it as buried as, like, a very loyal and popular dog in the time period when it wasn't actually a normal dog. So these operators were like Legion, and you cut off the heads. It was like watching a zombie army of the Civil War and all the gruesomeness that came with that fall down when you cut off those heads, and then cease and get locked up in its proper place, shut back up into the pit of hell where it belongs. Because a lot of the people in the Civil War it's like they had a brain infection, and that's where a lot of the cannibalism imagery comes from. Civil War soldiers, of them like eating each other and just getting into this gruesomeness, ghosts of the Civil War, but they make it very twisted a lot of times. And one place they did it at that they also tortured us with hybrids and creatures that was Lost Canyon. The Lost Kids in Lost Canyon. So there's many mausoleums where a lot of these entities were sealed. Some of the mausoleums, they speak for themselves. They say things like self, or the name evil will even be in the family, or the Bloods, or the Bloodhound gang came from, or the Bloodworths. Very strange names to these families. And it's just kind of like a Brothers Grimm reminder that eludes from a lot of these mausoleums, that serving the self leads to utter darkness, void space, and decay eternally. And that's their reward. So they lavish their tombs, just spent like mass amounts of money on these family mausoleums and crypts you can go into, and all the stuff they buried in there, sculptures, sphinxes, ugly green-faced pharaohs peering out of windows in their cemetery homes with black eyes. I mean, they really put a lot of detail into these things. So, but we knew who the real spiritual faces were, and the spirits that were operating in the bodies of these families and men. And sometimes we even had fights in, like, say, a very cursed so-called church in some of these graveyards, and then even would be breaking tombstones, breaking down their idols, breaking down their altars. Because some of these tombstones were very monstrous and hideous creatures on top of them and represented strongholds. So I do honor all the Confederate soldiers, because it was a very painstaking, hard thing to get through in so many areas at that time period. So many different levels of fighting going on, because in every war there's also secret wars. And it wasn't just about slavery, but many things in the spiritual aspect. Those who wished to be Time Lord slave masters were the real pushing and driving force behind that. They were wanting to feed off human pain and suffering, and it's like we were fighting the devil himself many times in people, and his obsession with mastering time and splicing time, trying to splice souls and spirits and make composites of everything, and their insanity in doing all that to make sure that his plans, we had to come in at certain points and make sure that his plans were not the final outcome, and that he was not allowed to go before the Lord's timing in things. Or to, say, bring like weather warfare tech into a past time period and wreak havoc, and all the different combinations of things that they can think of to do to mess with time and to mess with people's destinies, mess with people's fates. The humble graves, besides these grotesque ones of these families, usually lay on the other side of a Confederate cemetery. But they have like humble words, encouraging words on them, maybe Bible scriptures. They're not marked with all these Masonic imagery and all this other stuff. Or the IOF. We saw many of those houses fall too. And we saw thousands fall, and had to have help by angels to document graves, wash areas clean, and to have ourselves be undefiled from all the death that we'd witnessed and the carnage, so that our hands could be washed clean. And the only way to get your spirit, your soul, your body, your mind clean is through the blood of the Lamb. We were trained by Griggs at the English Landing area, many lake areas run by the Army Corps of Engineers. We actually had to swim through a lake that would kill you because it was so toxic, and not die, and get through it without jumping out of your body. We went through towns like Maryville, Quitman, where we just wanted to quit being run and activated through timeless scenarios. We saw the Santa Fe Trail wagon ruts, marks, and how people would get jumped in certain areas. Skidman was where we picked up speed and a second wind, and even got our wheels stuck in the mud relentlessly at times. Many people in these time periods were just always traveling. That was their life, their entire life, some of these people, and they would just stop and get necessities like bacon, whiskey, and just like 3 basic things sometimes at these stores too, and that was their supplies. And beans was a big supply. So there was actually towns named after comical things that some of the time travelers said while walking around. Sometimes whole Indian families would be slaughtered, like a Huron cemetery, where some of these entities would come out of nowhere, and some of them would be killed with hatchets and in horrible ways. So there's a lot of unmarked Native American cemeteries too that were part of the Civil War, but didn't get a lot of recognition. There were some Native sons of the Civil War that did get recognition, and some of them also turned Masonic, were turncoats, but you see that in every sector of war, and whose side you're on when the lines are drawn. So we were also kicked out of the Wellington Church because the town thought we were killing machines or a misunderstood band of marauders. We were programmed and talked like we were from the Wild West, and it was I just didn't understand that we were fighting wormhole technology and things that have to deal with spaceships and other things, advanced weapon system technology, that some of the slave masters hoarded and were body jumping with in the Civil War time period. So we also saw the Battle of Lexington, Fort Titus, where the 5 main slave masters conspired in America to implement their system of slavery on many levels, and the abolitionists, pro-abolitionists, anti-abolitionists, that whole thing. And also a place called Fort Africa, where they fought a lot of African American soldiers that were trying to prove themselves, and did many times. We're also trained in Camp Creek Branch and had connections with many other camps. Sometimes there would be like a Mandela effect happen though, and sometimes a name would change, or in one instance a grave marker had a name spelling that went backwards the next time we visited it in Kansas, which was a first. So you knew something was wrong then, and timelines and things like that would pop up. There was many wooden bridges you'd run across, many swinging bridges. One general at Camp Creek would lay my hands on the bridge like a sensory thing, and we'd listen to the sound of the road, like putting your ear to train track to hear it, and you'd hear underneath the creek how these water barrels were shooting out from the creek bridge through cannon barrels, because they looked like 2 steel cannon chutes that the water would shoot out of. So then you would get amped up and like feel war and victory in your veins, like a second skin. We saw men get ripped apart by dogs, first with their legs. We had to block out many things and have PTSD therapy too, because you couldn't unravel decades all at once. One body can't contain it all. So we saw Nazi Frankenstein sciences in different interludes. And in the Potawatomi River, I believe, is where we saw many people fight, and the body parts were moving so fast in the water, and people used broadswords back then, all sorts of things, and just hacked each other up. There would be heads floating down the river or a creek bed, and then if the flooding came, it would wash them out so fast you couldn't even collect body parts fast enough to put a whole body together, or pieces to bury somebody. So those were severe effects of war and PTSD. So there's many areas that have imprints, and many things imprinted even into the stones and the soil and into the scenery that you can see astrally and remember details of. So when you see a statue of a Confederate soldier, you see the difference in that versus modern statues of soldiers. And the ghostliness that comes with that, and the ghostly imagery, is for many, many reasons. And humanity still has open wounds, psychic debris, and a disconnect with social collective consciousness until humanity can come to a full knowledge of what and who the Messiah is, really, because that's the only power. The creator of the universe is the only power that can wash all the stains of war clean. But we still do need to honor the dead and the brave first waves of souls that sacrificed their lives for war, that most of the world still doesn't fully yet comprehend, and won't until Yahushua reveals on a godly and heavenly level spectrum to the entire world why all these wars of the world have happened, and what's been woven into all of the fabric of space and time. And when we see that unravel, when we all see the work that was done on the cross, then all will be revealed, sealed, and have closure, and that's when the world will be completed, the end of all ages. So then people can be transformed inwardly by that light of Christ that shines into all dark places, making known what was once unknown, because he's the one who holds all the answers to all the mysteries and is the key and door to the heavenly stations. Until we go home, we're still subjected to the flesh and the stations of identity here. So the Kansas City Braves really deserve that name because it represents the region and the things that I saw there, the bravery and defiance of evil that stood up, and people coming together and raising a standard of righteousness together. Because many sorcerers were meddling with time tech and many things. Even if an angel had an assignment here, and say was helping a group of kids, say that was going to go get slaughtered out in the middle of nowhere, say like Pig's Landing, big muddy area, Cooley Lake region, which they took many kids to from the first Pizzagate operation, which was in Raytown, at the Funhouse Pizza Hub with the red wheel spoke lights. Okay, say an angel would go and help like 20 kids that were taken out there in the middle of nowhere, off public access areas that nobody knows about. If there are sorcerers or were sorcerers involved in certain instances that had like portal tech or some advanced tech to try to trap one of God's highest, like say they would try to trap an angel into the technology or something, that we saw also would incite the wrath of God. So a lot of things the tech could do and did do, but there was also higher powers on high. And we saw this in Kirksville when a killer cyclone came out of nowhere because sorcerers had abducted certain individuals and trapped them into a church. The church ends up getting hit by this killer cyclone. It explodes, and people get impaled in the town. Babies are thrown. A piano flies up in the air. All sorts of things happened. And the cyclone went directly for the courthouse. Because when God is unleashing justice, or you're messing with his beloved, say his prophets that he calls his friends, his dear friends, people like this that have a high anointing or calling in their life, you're going to incite the wrath of the Most High. And we saw that several times too. So a lot of the times their plans didn't work in what they were trying to do. They were trying to trap certain individuals back in a time period, or try to see what would work and what wouldn't with trying to entrap people with the tech. So a lot of times it backfired on them. One of the babies even had a mark just like Harry Potter on the forehead that looked like a lightning bolt after all the cyclone went through and ran its course. And it like started from a pond in a very small town. So it wasn't weather warfare or some freak accident. It was from on high. It's the wrath of God. So when God shows up, things like that happen, and he will prove his sovereignty and that he will not be mocked. So in the end of some of these ghost town events and instances, me, Cass, and Lendon were three people that were left by ourselves a lot at the end. Gun City was one place we had events at, and Shell City, Strong City was always a breath of fresh air after many events that were defeated. It was like a tail end spot in the middle of nowhere with a train depot. And there was a stockyard there where people were gathering supplies and whatnot. But the people who lived there were very evil and practicing sorcery at night in the dining room with candles and making blood pacts with the devil. And that's how they retained their power in Kansas primarily. So we actually ended up going into shops, buildings, blasting holes through things, using cannons, other things. We saw men get scalped at times, and intervened with certain scalping ambushes at night in houses. So there's a lot of reptilian entities that were coming out of the woodworks in the Civil War time period. They had almost the guarding stations for like livestock areas, horse areas, feed mills, grain elevators, supply stores, anything that they knew that people needed, and anything that we pick up on the way, sometimes we were hijacked at. So some of these buildings, they look very brutal, and their remnants and their remains, because because there was a lot of corruption that got left there. They look totally just decimated and devastated now. Desolate voids. And they look haunted for many reasons. Especially certain asylums that we had seen many crazy things at too. The Osawatomie Asylum was the worst place I think we'd ever seen in our entire lives. So we also protected Thomas Hart Benton. We saw the crossing of the View, the disaster that happened there. Abe Lincoln was overtaken and turned into a monster. He killed a land surveyor in cold blood and then went back to his home a week later as if nothing had happened. And now there's a head bust of crazy Abe that's just sitting in front of this man's house. And there's movies that were made of him fighting vampires, fighting werewolves, things like that. But they did clone Abraham Lincoln and send it back in time. We were training for the Battle of Pilot Knob. Told we could sleep in this cave up the hill that they called Bearcat Hotel. Many of these places are very rough. Ozark Mill was, many bad things were there. John Jr. got lowered into the water by a man named Horton, which had an alligator in it, and just to see if he knew what to do. But his foot actually got bitten off. And kids got chased around by this double dam area there, and then were threatened to be put in these steel grate openings that went way down into the water too. So other times you'd go to have missions assignments at certain pioneer village homes, Stockton Ranch, Clover Cliff Ranch in Kansas. Centers that Army stopped at and needed things for. But sometimes it would feel like you were a sitting duck at some of these places too, especially at the Oklahoma home on the range, which was just this little cabin that people used sometimes. Because you never knew what was going to come out of the shadows, out of these old dark nights, these hills that seemed to have eyes, all the valleys and all the mounds. Settlers Village was brief and temporary. There was these tiny, tiny house-looking banks that were set up in certain towns, and those places were always in danger of getting robbed. We did have an extraction point at the top of a Kansas City building that had Portal Tech open up in it, but now it has a flashing neon sign instead that goes in circles. So we'd have to try to retain all this visual content and all these layers of it. Visual markers have personal ambiguity to portray anonymity anyway, always, and be able to talk in private. And the thing that was attacked in our minds was our visual cortex, to kind of strip that out of us, because we were very good at having photographic memories and being driven in like town squares or circles and retaining all the visual textual content. So I had to focus very hard when I was mind wiped at Mexico, Missouri, to retain all those markers, cues, and dispel the word magic and triggers, and symbols and statues that they used too, and all the old time clocks, from them erasing all contextual gaps in memory banks to keep it together somehow, in even strings or quantum strings. Because I could remember, okay, say a number of windows in a street block, like a letter, like MMMMM would be at a certain building, dates on buildings, cornerstones, angles, just certain things that stick out to you. And that would fill in time losses with time-enriched bank information into your subconscious zones. And then that comes back as later apprehension, retrieval, and take out the trash of other mind-numbing tricks. We were called the renowned Tiger Squad Army of Centennials at one point. Many town squares had parades, and Windows were decorated a lot with centennial imagery. Hapuska, we call it the Pawpaw or Ha area, like a point of no return into these crazy prairie lands. Some towns just seem like a blink of an eye, that you just stop and stay towns. Squares, town squares were a tool that they used to mind wipe a lot of the time. And before that would be an image of a square mandala too, that would be sublayered into the overlay systems that they used to do that, until all the town squares and areas we had been to were blended into one another concurrently. And it's like black Dianetics too, black geometric lock doors, the Mind War, and all the trails, because we had been trained at hundreds of miles of main trails through a Centralia area. And my first altar's name was Kate, or Katie, so they named it Katie Trail. John Ritter, we also met at the Ball of Twine town, and he wasn't really conditioned enough to be a super soldier, so they tried to make him one, but he failed miserably at it. So he gets a role in the movie The Hero, and that was about it. So he didn't really like us very much after that. He was jealous of us kids. He had his own ridge mask and handlers to deal with, so our time with him was very brief and strange. Then we were taken to Finger Lakes by the Pinnacle Point area and the covered bridge. And what they do there is we'd have to run these obstacle courses that they later covered up evidence for and made it into a bicycle motocross obstacle course thing, and also a mud bog area. So when we were there, it was like going to this little creek area that had little tiny falls, two little tiny waterfalls going down it, and you'd look over to the left, and in this little cleft space there, you would see this gross, Bigfoot, hairy, like golden creature sitting there just staring at you evilly, studying the word, while you got water there or washed your hands. And he was like sitting behind this hanging moss, which made his face look even more creepy. But you could sense that presence right away. And this was the training. So when the psi contact was made, initiated, he'd stand up and start chasing you through the trails and the woods. And we also had a time like this that they were doing necromancy in graveyards also, and having us stand as posts to try to override their necromancy efforts and attempts. And then you'd get chased down by the river. We actually did see people rise from the dead in the wooded areas, but at first it was almost like a joke, because this one guy, when I turned around, that was chasing me down by the river, actually had like mummified rags on his face. So they throw everything they can possibly think at you. So this Bigfoot creature they probably created was also in the water, and they had these tall reeds area that would just stick way up out of the water, like murky water. And this water now it just looks black. So a lot of bad experiences happen in dark water, black water. So by the time you would get out of there and by the shore, you just feel like this boggy, waterlogged, drowned cat. Sometimes they even threw me in the water with pants on or jeans on. So then you get chased down this hard sand cliff area too, hide in certain spots. We did this several times. And we did see 6 fingers on this wood creature, and giants have that same genomic carryover to them, 6 toes, 6 fingers, so that's why they call it Finger Lakes. And a lot of these areas are named after sinister things. People have no idea. They should just named it 6 Finger Lakes. So many bridges were taken out in a lot of these areas. One bridge had a split wood center in the middle of it, and then we had to run on the bridge, and then me and John had to split 2 ways and run 2 different ways and meet our handler on the other side that had handheld tech who also messed with our heads. Tried to split me and John's quantum entanglement up at times. We saw the Battle of Centralia, many blood-stained fields, many places. It was just very thick. Oxbot, Oxbase, Jesuit graveyards, Masonic, different types of graveyards, dragon families. And in the early 1900s, they were experimenting with what would work and what wouldn't work with early actors. And they first, in the Nazi experimentation, realized that consciousness can be transferred into chimpanzees. So they successfully did that, and then used that as a fear tactic to say, oh, you're going to be stuck in an animal for the rest of your life. So you have to do this. You have to go along with these programs and other things. So that's how kids got hooked into bad situations and bad agreements with different fighting factions, because there are good factions of the intelligence agency, but a lot wasn't that we interacted with and actually got rescued from the bad factions. So I'm very thankful for many rescues too. So one area they also took us to was, I believe it's something like a C, Cleveland, Missouri, or some area where it's very remote. Dropped us off there. We thought we were loose, we could run. This was in the early parts of training, and we just run up to all these cars, and we thought, oh, we're going to take off or get help or something. And it turns out all these cars were very morbid, purposely put there in front of a graveyard to instill the entrapment, because they were full of very cryptic mannequins and skeletons. And in the back seat of one of these cars that I tried to open up, that was by a police car that just had a mannequin in it, were these monkey men that were life-size monkey men sitting in the back seat with top hats and all this traumatizing imagery that they knew would affect you, and a woman in the front. So they used the monkey men because it triggered a fear response from earlier childhood realization of the consciousness transfer into primates. So moving beyond that, in the early 1900s, I experimented with early actors before Hollywood or anything. So Buster Keaton was also a clone, Greta Garbo, John Gilbert, and they would transfer you into some of these types of characters, and then use that childlike innocence and spark to draw a crowd on stage. Because some of these people, like Greta, was actually tortured by handlers, and Buster Keaton, they put a ring on his neck from the swimming pool life ring that said SS Navigator for the special skills he had attained. And he's the one who actually did the holding onto the back of the train with his hands, which brought a lot of humor into situations and into the early Clone Wars, which ended abruptly with a showdown at the Artesian Hotel in Sulphur, Oklahoma. It was like a clone resistance party there, and it was of epic proportions, and it caused the hotel to be shut down. And we saw many buildings crumble, actually. That to us, it was like 9/11 coming down, but there were victories in other places with the early Clone Wars. Sukharoth energy was carried into certain named families, these ancient creatures that they try to bring back and to try to have as pets or hide and create bases and all the things that they try to do. So families named like Sugaroth or Sugaroos or the Borers, those are all bad bloodlines too, especially the evil Sizers. Jim Bridger, they had nicknamed James, and many other characters that we saw through history. We saw Blind Boone at the Blind Boone Park. We had many compadres, comrades, fallen factions, but most of all, we had a real family and friends, many of which are in heaven now. We saw the Trail of Death with the Potawatomis and Spring Hill Farms in Kansas. It was a stopping point. We trained also at Alagawaho in Kansas, which was very crazy, and saw giants there and Indian battles there too. And we also peered into Time Tech West in places, in canyons, where you would actually see like a pterodactyl bird or something out there, which was very terrifying. And those things were evil. All dinosaurs were evil. I saw them through the Time Tech. They were bloodthirsty. There was basically no way to fight them except for hiding in a rock. And the Civil War period was just brutal. Guns played a part in it, but it wasn't all we got. We saw places like Arrow Rock, Montserrat, Council Bluff, which is a prominent feature, and the cannonball that was stuck in the Lauren, Kansas city building pillar. We also saw many mines, Boone's Lick, salt mining there. That place was like a cartoon at first, because if you had already seen the future, okay, and you go to some very primitive place in the past, like early 1800s, it's like a comic book to you, because men were like doing the weirdest things, pushing wheels with their feet and making these crazy wooden contraptions that looked like they were going to fall apart, like tinker toys and old rickety spokes for water wheels and stuff. So they were on all these different levels and stations up in the air, like they were on a paddle boat. And there was these huge fires in the deep woods, like you were walking through this orc village in the Lord of the Rings or something. And it was very dark, um, very cryptic place. There's moss everywhere, ferns. I got stuck in the mud with my whole body, being chased by a reptilian man there, and he tried to pull me out. I thought I was like a goner there. There's salt everywhere, salt brines. So if you got cut, it was like salty mud in your wounds, your eyes too, and it hurt. And they also put people down inside of this 1,100-foot tunnel that they bore into the ground, and then had capped it with looked like a top of a bell. So you'd be afraid of being thrown down in there, but there was actually entities there that were eating people and like putting them down into that salt vat bucket to brine humans and to eat humans. My favorite character was John Brown, and we all loved him, and almost as much as General Buzzard. He was one of a kind. Like the name's John Titor, which there were 7 of total. They just got coded into things like Tommy Travels, represent time traveler or something like that. But Charlie Sheen, he couldn't even hold a candle to this man. And when we found out that satanic Charlie Sheen later on was DNA cloned from him, it was insulting. Because we knew the fire and the spirit of John Brown and his territory, all the ways that he paved as a waymaker for so many things, and using trains for good instead of bad, because the orphan trains that they used back then and all the advertising send all the children on these trains, that was reptilian based, and that was many hijacks on many trains, and that was one of the hardest things to see of how they were siphoning all of these children and then making excuses and making explosions at a winery or other places to account for all the lost children that were on those orphan trains that got taken. So the spirit of John Brown was anti-slavery and in eternal war with slavery. And he helped slaves, was a great leader, trusted friend, father figure to many people. He trained many people. We'd have like 7 steps to a certain mission or something. There weren't fighting normal men back then. So what they did, and the people that were in John Brown's house and upstairs told him exactly what he had to do and what he was up against, because we saw the faces of the draconians that took over the reprobate men. Now, these men, they all took up broadswords when the time was right. It was time to act, and they went and dismembered the 5 main powerhouses of the slavery rings. These 5 men, they hacked to pieces. Heads were cut off, everything. I mean, this is not normal warfare back then. Because Dracos have 2 hearts, you have to cut off their heads. And they ended up hanging John Brown in the streets. And in Blackjack Park, Sean was having seizures and hiccups, kept jumping his consciousness everywhere, because that was his go-to thing to do, and he wouldn't follow orders to kill the enemy's animals so that they could be slowed down, so then he was taken out of the mission. The watchmen that were in these little Frisco depot boxes outside of areas and train stations, we called the time police, that were waiting for you in certain areas. I also saw the Wright brothers turn wrong in Chanute, Missouri, and didn't want certain blueprints or patents to go to another man in Chanute. So clone bodies also didn't have vocal cords, so when you could break free of being mute sometimes and override body entrapment, then you'd be able to do like a war cry or something very effective with your voice in the spiritual realm that could liberate and break through strongholds, especially in like canyon areas. We also saw snake people at Galena. They had a infestation of snakes coming out of the water there that were killing people. The devil planted these snakes and these infestations from the cave system Virgin Bluff area. And they wanted to corrupt this area and have a virgin sacrifice there and get into people's bodies through this folk magic called the Mad Stones. And people were getting bit by snakes and dying left and right. So they didn't have faith because the devil had chipped away at that already. So they were desperate to get cured and healed. So then when this couple, a witch and a warlock, brings these black and green red mad stones to town and then fake heals two people, performing false signs and wonders and miracles, the town goes crazy. And they all wanted to try these mad stones. So we saw like entities come out behind trees and spirits come out of nature and how they were attached to these stones. And the shadows, and they were filthy spirits in these stones, and then what people would do is they would apply it in a blood right pact right into their arm or skin, and not knowing they were the victims. They would apply the stones, make the blood pact, because it's touching your blood from your bloody snake bite. And I'm sure they told them a little thing to say while they did that, so people fell for this. And we had to tell them what was going on. Many people didn't believe it. And then what happened is that a lot of these people eventually got the spirit of insanity in their bloodstream. And then murders happened in town that were covered up in the area. The old swinging bridge collapsed and became corrupt, and tornadoes came into the path. And we had to come back at different time periods because the infections came in waves and lingered there for decades, just rotting people's brains until they went mad because of the mad stones. And I ended up fighting one sorcerer in a log cabin that had shapeshifted into the real snake-faced human with red eyes that he was, and he would not relinquish these bloodstones very easily. So the cursed mad stones that made people eventually go mad was because they didn't realize that they made an agreement with the enemy and that sorcery can corrupt their minds and enter their bloodstream. And so many things were buried and sealed and went back into the holes where they belonged, into the earth. And people learned they can't be gullible, and they lack discernment. You're going to worship nature, trust nature more than God, who is your ultimate healer, deliverer, and redeemer. And it's sad. So men that have to be dismembered are for a reason. It's because they're not men. On the Creamery Bridge, there was reptilian men that was trying to defend slavery and had a cannonball there. These people were insane that were fighting to keep slavery. We were also on Meriwether's dredge boat, Mary Times, and the dredge crew. And this was also inspiration for the River World series, which tied into Twainiac, Maniacs. We also saw whooping cough and other illnesses sweep through areas in Brownsville. The Little Brown Church in the Vale was like a memory game of the key, and it looked like a real-life woman who lived in a shoe fairy tale place. And there was sorcery in there and shapeshifters. We also went to Northmore Castle, Hahatonka Castle, Bishop Castle, in the times of the Castle Crashers Castle Lost startup. And that was mainly in America at the beginning. And Conan and the Dragon was on the door to one of them. The Crescent Hotel was called the Castle in the Sky. We saw terrible things in the Elizabeth Catholic Church that was in front of that had this black circle caps on top of it. And then this red light would flood into the church several times at night. And most SS kids from our group are quite American, even though some have been displaced into families and live in Canada, the UK, and Australia primarily. But they're as American at heart on a soul level as American Pie still is, because that's been the majority of their life. I also fought a female reptilian that crawled out of the magnetic springs at first when I crawled up there, and was actually fighting this magnetism in the water, this water battle with her. We saw the naming of Lovelock, Colorado, and how it started with a red bridge that we'd be chased on that was near Kansas City and Lovers Lane, Evans Field, MK Programming Lane. And we had to lock up love with padlocks on the bridge. And then to go to Lovelock, Colorado, and do the same thing. So we also went to Lewis and Clark parks, trails, ferries from Missouri to Kentucky several times, more creek battles, more non-humans fighting humans, Fort D, Cape Girardeau prisoners, and interrogation sessions there, getting chased while driving through Cairo, Illinois, and men would be like looking out of the windows of these decrepit buildings waiting for you to drive by, and on the train tracks going under the bridge out of your way out of the town, very derelict area. We also saw Sappington's torture chamber in Saline Solution County for slaves that he was actually putting into his doctor's chamber and bleeding out, peeling their skin off with his devices. And it was in the stone building that looked like a caboose-looking cell. And while this was going on, the rest of the slaves were trying to run over this little stone bridge and escape, and many were killed in the creek near that area for trying to escape. So we saw many monsters that were the heads of slavery times. Many natives were killed with hatchets. Like I said, they had unmarked graves. There's lots of land grabbing going on, putting up black obelisks in certain areas. Those were the beginning of all the land power grabs. Now it's more just political power grabs and other types of grabs. Back then it was just all about land, mainly, and other raw energies that were dealt with. And land surveying was a huge deal, and marking places. Very territorial spirits these were. And we'd have many obstacles to go through in the middle of nowhere. The Katy Bridge also had two big little, well, it was a big bridge, but it had two little houses that were on top of this bridge. So it was very bizarre looking. It's like something out of a children's book, but we had to deal and climb up on top of that bridge. The two little houses on top of the bridge and deal with reptilians up there in the middle of the night, demonic creatures. And the matriarchal demonic creatures that we also saw were the ones with long hair, just as Revelation speaks about. Female long hair. That's what they look like when they manifest, and when they can take children out to remote places like they did at Pig's Landing, then they show their real faces to you, and they try to scare you with their faces and act psychotic with their faces. So we learned all their tactics and how their games work, and to not buckle with them showing their real faces first of all, to get you to not react or respond smart and efficiently and effectively, or try to get kids to run or hide them, or whatever your strategic moves were against these reptilian murderers. So on Katy Trail, I also saw this other matriarchal demonic creature come out of the swamp pond area, and it was one of the most disturbing things I saw, because she looked like a turtle at first, and then flipped over, and then I saw the entity that was standing there, standing face to face with her on the dirt trail. So we saw a lot of this grotesque sorcery. I also saw the same creature at Rock House on the Wilder Estates in the middle of the night. And Laura Ingalls Wilder and that whole family were very cultish. Laura and Almanzo and the Rock House, they were actually running from like a head female sorcerer. So many railroad buildings got burned down for reasons. In this cornering and chasing game. One of the houses also that we went to was called, we called it the Snuffleupagus house, because it was a big red brick building that had vines growing all over it. And they had set it up and opened a door on the side to make it seem as if you were going to be in a room that operated like a church. And then in other areas, it was like gangsters were operating. And in the back, it had housed child porn and child porn sessions. So that place was right next to a place where a little train area on a cement platform had been burned down, and we called it Hulk's house, because the kid that was programmed with Hulk, Dave, went full force, wood walls, everything was just ripped out and thrown out of rage. And them using triggers from this Snuffleupagus house with the word snuff in it for a reason to trigger our rage. Sometimes handlers would actually let you vent and release anger and tear structures down too. Some places you couldn't touch. So they ended up painting this cement platform bright green and then just putting signs around it, don't trespass. So hope the one who ripped apart all the wooden beams there and had an epic time there. And this place is also next to train tracks that were built in 1927. And one had a steel railing that was rounded out coming from the top of it. And you'd look down on the street and the train tracks would be behind you. So we'd all pretend like we ran the trains and that was our platform. And you'd write things on the wooden panels and stuff. And a lot of times I would jump down from that platform into one of the kids' arms. And that's where boxcar children came from. So we'd have our train tickets in our hands and go through these white marble and red painted small gate steps. And it was, once you were in there, it was like a circus back there in a big round building and all these shops and people hustling and bustling everywhere. And usually over this one prize depot area on the tracks, the moon would always be shining over it on the night. And it was like a barn/restaurant type area. And it was a main point for the jump trains. And some of these places still have, on the train tracks, phantom signatures, like the Montauk main project, Camp Hero, that connects with other Montauk projects and other nodal points, and certain train track areas where they use jump trains, like a quantum resonance ABC jump point. Those still have a phantom pulse or signature, so that's called an anomaly. They don't know what to do with it, so they just seal off these areas and make excuses for them and just leave them alone and don't let the public mess with them, basically, or make some little bureaucracy city ordinance rule to why you'll be prosecuted if you touch the rocks in the area or whatever. Sometimes in the drops and missions, you get dropped off in areas in the middle of nowhere, like Newton, Kansas, on just pure dirt, smelly areas, farms. And some of these families frequented the corridors of time and hunted the time soldiers' turf, like the Hasseltines, Rasputin's line, called the Time Hasslers, Snodgrasses, and many other families that were involved in the train trafficking and the initial setups of the orphan trains, train trafficking, hijacking. Fire Lake, we also saw have holy fire rain down on it in Oklahoma. One of the main train hub areas, depots, had like white Spanish architecture on it, and the building on top of it said Fright, F-R-E-I-G-T, but it was a real fright area because you were always running to that area. And I would be threatened to throw into the flooding muddy waters that had all those lined up walled waterways that the creek bed went through that were all stone. And in this early time period, they did the sorcery, the Egyptian sorcery, where you would see an alligator that wasn't really there. So you'd think, oh, if I'm going to be thrown in the water, I'm going to get ate by an alligator. So the alligator was a huge initial fear tactic. But after time, you realized there wasn't an alligator in these flooding waters that people actually did drown in, and you could get yourself out of it and crawl out. So certain areas we called time windows, time bridges. Other areas you would have training in where you'd have to actually swim through a whole flooded lake area to the other side, switch your clothes, and the town would be on the other side of the lake. We also went to Estes Park Hotel, Colorado, where The Shining was filmed, the Missouri Hotel, where the aristocracy had trafficked kids, and next door to that, and this big gray 520 stone castle from hell down the street that was across the street also from the first Frisco depot, where Hulk was tortured at and whipped like a slave at, and they had him in there for about 10 days. And what happened was when Hulk got out of that train depot that had the words police written on a bulb outside of it. That wasn't far from the Snuffleupagus house. We all stood in a circle, held hands, and we saw the whippings on his back, and we felt raindrops come down. And he said that God shed a tear, and the ground cracked open in front of us. And then he had a tear run down his eye, and we all released that pain and the blows that he took for us, because he came in to protect and help in the situations. Pella, Iowa also had very sick openings there of interdimensionals, and a main waterway ran through the town that was very gory and bloody looking to us. And they also used the Dutch mill programming and trapped us in these Dutch mills at the beginning a lot of times. And I was cornered by interdimensionals by the paintings in an alleyway there, and tried to run and not touch the waterways. They could also use water as a type of entrancing zone too. So we were also inside the main Dutch mill that had a fireplace like Hansel and Gretel in there, and a man was in there that he was actually trying to burn kids in. So I'd sit in that mill, the Dutch mill, by this window where there was purple curtains, and at the end of that, what I saw come out of that mill was a big snake that was wrapped around it. Traer, Iowa also had this spiral staircase that came out on Main Street. We'd have these weird chases on, which looked quite comical, but not as comical as the bucking flamingo old rodeo bull like riding that was in front of a Powahasca hotel. One of us was also in the Hermit Cave, who was walking in spiritual authority and totally unrepressed and free at the time, unshackled. They called this man the Hermit of the Future, El Porvenir. And he also lived in a tree prior to this, but the devil came in at that time after he left and tried impersonating him and then mind wiping in that cave, but it didn't work. Because, say, like if somebody does fast for 40 days or somebody really is reaching spiritual acclimation, the devil will manifest to you, and he can't stand you. He cannot stand anybody walking in full potential here. And then that's when he attacks. He attacks at your weaknesses, but he also comes when you're strongest too. Many of the kids were triggered and drugged at the Hilltop Motel in Kansas City that I later bulldozed. We'd be on the roofs there, and then we were called the Human Wrecking Balls crew, and we would stand in a line and bust through every wall in consecutive line order through this motel. Well, going back to the Salt Lick area, Mackey Lick, Boone's Lick, these guys were called Lick for a reason. Like I said, they had humans in a well there that was 1,100 feet into the ground, filled with salt. He had an appetite. We also ended up running from a large killifish that they put in the water too. That was like a GMO killifish. So to us, it looked like a really big killifish coming down the creek bed when it flooded. And we also would get stuck in the mud at these instances, because they can literally create monsters out of little things, little creatures, and they have laboratories for this. They create things and have manufactured beings on spaceships. St. Genevieve had a matriarch in the water there that was throwing kids up to the ceiling in a little pool of water in that disgusting cave. And they actually had barrels of blood stacked up inside of that cave. And now it's a winery. And we were the kids in Lost Canyon going into the caves before it became this public sham that has zombie Civil War soldiers scattered everywhere, and beasts and caves that are labeled like bat's blood and other things, and the other caves that they blocked off access to. We were there before any of that was there. And they used those imageries to bring us down there once with the VTK and brain gate technology. to rerun scenarios in our heads and post these dead Civil War Confederate soldiers to try to get into our minds and mess with our minds. And that's where Confederate zombies came from, because we saw men turn into monsters, and it was a time of monsters and men and get infected. Waubonsee Park, Iowa was also one of these areas, and lookout posts, just like Warsaw is too. We also saw the women's suffrage movement with their yellow umbrellas. We were under General Funston, who had also went to Antarctica, in the Arctic regions, I think on 16 to 22 missions. And we knew the Browns and Partridge family. Their eternal fight we saw with the abolitionist era. We saw hangings. Lots of hangings happened at the Cottonwood Falls area, Chase County Courthouse. They were hanging people right upstairs at top level in the old window of the courthouse on a platform. We also saw this creature come out of Stockton Ranch that they held in one of the Cold Springs area. And they would actually stand and shoot people in the legs and have a watch post on that farm. And could see people coming into the driveway from a long distance away. We saw lots of water soldier battles, Wallace State Park. We also saw spiritual weapons, like fighting with swords of the spirit that kills spirits and sends them to the abyss, severs them. A lot of times that happened at these perverse cemetery chapels and the Davis Monument in Hiawatha. The Wilders, like I said, were cursed. They had their Sunnyside School for the Blind. A witch ran that and was keeping the kids blinded by the light of the black sun and invoking that into that classroom. And then she would take away senses from them, like hearing for some of them, down to 4 generations through the Horton line. El Dorado Springs, Missouri had a pioneer wagon jump crew, and these reptilian murders happened in the Springs fountains there, and a grindstone wash basin that's full of satanic ritual energy. And I almost got lost into the grates of the early springs when attacked there too. One man that was in front of a grain elevator in a gray stone building had a black snake in front of one of his windows in his basement, so that the kids would be scared of that. And it was hissing, and I taught the kids how to move it, so I'd be afraid of that. And some of these spiritual strongholds are still in places. Like if you go to like a very haunted place or something, and there's no snake in the window, say, and you hear that hissing snake, that's in the spirit realm, the hissing snake demon. And the Lord will wipe through these places, make them stubble, and sweep through them with a broom of destruction, because so many are falling, and many things are continuing to get cleared and transformed. A lot of times soldiers' graves were named like unknown CSA and then have a number on them. Poorhouses, poor farms where people were attacked and vulnerable, just like orphanages or insane asylums were at the time. There was a main windmill programmer at the Craiga Windmill Farm, and that place was a nightmare in itself if you get dropped off there. And then finally the windmill programming stopped. We saw formations of early time arches, before they made modern bale arches or other things. This was installed at the Neosho camp called Arch Camp, and this was experienced before the time arch happened at the Gypsy camp, where we walked through the arch portal gate time tech there. Nebraska City also had strange activities on and off, and the Arbor Ranch Mansion is where we got seeds and planted oak trees to come back and see the tree grown full height 100 years later. And it's also where they killed a horse of mine called Phaeton. And after I was attacked in a horse stall there, sometimes you get favor with government and worked on farms when courthouses were just elaborate glorified farm home circles back then. Monogow Springs held treasure troves for the younger brothers in the caves, and one of them you had to take a boat across from the main Springs Bluffs area. And Hooker Jail near the Lone Wolf St. Louis ruins also triggered fear into many kids in the program, from the Hooker Hood family earlier times that had the connotation attached to it for child hookers. The lone wolf programming came from this lone wolf club, and that's where they dropped some of us off at for the lone wolf part of that time program to see if you could handle yourself on your own and try to pass a certain area without being harassed by certain men at a wall. It was like a gangster hideaway lone wolf club lodge, like an initiation rite of passage or something. And Miss Abel Reese's Monkey Tower Castle Habitat is where earlier I said they trapped consciousness into chimpanzees, and they kept a couple kids overnight in those chimpanzees, their consciousness intact in them, in this little castle there. And that was where they would bring kids back sometimes as a threat to comply, continuing with certain things in these experiments and programs furthering their agendas, or they'd be trapped in the monkey zoo forever. And supposedly they named her Miss Abel and sent her to space, one of the chimpanzees. Mr. Knight was a time assassin and was put in a psych unit military facility and tortured, and his family members hid. Some people they called time runners, and they were also good at hiding kids, and they'd want to take those people out fast, the bad faction. One of the places, or the main square city areas where they erected a Statue of Liberty was called, it had the sign on it, and it just said drive out. So you'd always be like running out of this town circle square and see the sign drive out of the area. Bon Terre Cave, we call the Bone Terrors Cave. The bone terrors that we saw, these reptilians that were arched up on certain cave platforms and in the water that you had to fight. And Jacob's Cave was also a decrepit cave where they put all these crazy little jack-in-the-boxes and markers and scary things because a boy named Jacob had died in there. So it was like, they made this cave into like some Toyland or cryptic connotation of his disappearance, and they actually put like a red devil sitting up into one part of the cave too, looking down at you. Tawasagi area had held Arnold's Cave, which was deplorable beyond measure, and this cave looked like a hog space. Like, these hog spaces in the stones looked like they were sticking out of the rocks in the cave everywhere, and it just looked very twisted. And they put a sign up on that mound there that said temple site, which most mounds, they're skeletal mounds, giants, and it was hard getting out of that one, but we managed, and there was a high priestess there, matriarch, that was on the mound at the end and wanted to dedicate this place and continue ancient sacrificial orders and ordinances there from South America, the times of Mayan periods. So with the orphan trains, I just know that the innocent children that were all lost and killed through that shuffle system, the Lord's counted them all in, and they're all waiting for their vengeance, along with all the kids who were at the Cooley Lake region. So the Riddick Cave was another area that they tested me at, and Riddick, to see if you could go in and crawl into that area and function and navigate and fight, but most of all to see in the dark. And so I crawl into this cave, and it's like a ringing bell in there because it's on the side of a cliff of a hill. There's water in there, and then there's this female beast inside of the cave with long hair that came out, and it was in front of these mansion steps that kids were being taken from. So you follow this red brick road with yellow lines to the Roanoke Cave. This creature was in there, and you could hear like echoing deep in this dripping cave system wall. So that was, she actually slammed me against the wall. That was a pretty traumatic event too. But Roanoke is Riddick's original cave. Dave Rock Conservation Area had many fights too, and spying going on. Onyx Cave has a petrified dragon-looking dog face that we actually saw petrified into the walls there. Because a lot of petrified rocks you see are body parts of the war in heaven that came down here, and fallen angel parts, giant parts, the offspring, the children hybrids, creatures, the whole lot of them. It's just like scattered all over this earth. We also fought the first Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. That was the Laugh-O-Gram studio, where a draconian was in there, and kids were going there after school and being harmed. We also had encounters at Wamego, Humansville, that was named after it was cleared of all the non-humans, so that humans could live there safely. And Cross Timbers, and places like Rough Hollow, which was very rough. Many center townships. All these places reminded me of Yellville, Arkansas, where we had lost the Flash in the woods that didn't make it back in time for the portal.